There's a particular kind of trust that exists in small towns, a trust so fundamental it becomes invisible, like the air itself. You trust that the person who waves at you from their porch each morning means you no harm. You trust that the volunteer who shows up with coffee and flashlights at 3 a.m. to search for your missing child is doing so out of genuine concern. You trust that monsters, when they exist at all, announce themselves clearly. They wear masks. They lurk in shadows. They are strangers. But sometimes the monster is the man standing next to you, calling out your daughter's name into the darkness. Sometimes the monster is the uncle who designed the missing person flyer, who chose the photograph, who selected the font. Sometimes evil doesn't hide in the woods at all. It hides in plain sight, behind a concerned expression and a helping hand. This is a story about two cases separated by state lines in 1 year of time, but united by a single, suffocating truth. The person searching was the person who made the search necessary. The night air in Miller's Creek carried the scent of October wood smoke curling from chimneys, the earthy sweetness of decaying leaves, and that particular metallic tang that precedes the first search frost. It was a Friday night, and the lights from the high school football field cast an amber glow that reached all the way to Main Street 3 blocks away. You could hear the marching band's drums if you stood still enough, a rhythmic heartbeat that made the whole town feel alive. Evan Blake was 17 years old that autumn. He had his mother's thoughtful eyes and his father's reserved demeanor, the kind of kid who spent more time listening than talking, who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries without being asked, who would graduate in the spring and plan to study forestry at the state university. His friends called him Steady. His mother called him her old soul. Josh Carnes was Evan's opposite in almost every way: loud, where Evan was quiet; impulsive, where Evan was measured. He played varsity basketball and had a laugh that could fill a gymnasium. He'd just gotten his driver's license 2 months prior and treated his parents' Chevy Blazer like it was a Ferrari, washing it every Saturday morning until the blue paint gleamed. Mia Dalton was the valedictorian in waiting, a girl who carried a worn paperback in her backpack at all times and who had already been accepted early decision to 3 colleges. She wore her dark hair in a practical ponytail and had a habit of pushing her glasses up her nose when she was thinking hard about something. She tutored kids at the elementary school on Tuesday afternoons and wanted to be a teacher. Claire Rivers was the artist of the group. She saw the world in colors and compositions, always sketching in the margins of her notebooks. She'd just had her first piece accepted into a regional art show, a watercolor of the creek at sunrise, that her art teacher said showed remarkable maturity. She dreamed of moving to a city someday, somewhere with museums and galleries, but she loved Miller's Creek with a fierceness that surprised even her. The 4 of them had been friends since middle school, bound together by a chemistry that made sense only to them. They were the kind of tight-knit group that small towns produce, kids who knew each other's families, who'd attended each other's birthday parties since they were 6, who could communicate in half sentences and knowing looks. That Friday night, they watched the football game from the bleachers, sharing a bag of popcorn and complaining about the cold. Miller's Creek lost 28-14, but nobody seemed to care much. After the game, around 9:30 p.m., they piled into Josh's Blazer, Mia riding shotgun, Evan and Claire in the back, and headed toward the dairy barn on Route 12 for milkshakes, as they did most Friday nights. But they never made it. According to later witness statements, Josh had suggested taking the shortcut, a narrow, winding road called Cutter's Pass that wound through dense woods and shaved about 10 minutes off the drive. Locals called it Devil's Bend, because of a particularly sharp curve where the road seemed to disappear into the trees. There were stories about that stretch of road, the kind of folklore that accumulates in rural places. A hitchhiker who vanished in 1967, strange lights seen through the pines, the persistent rumor that a cult had performed rituals there in the 1970s. But these were practical kids, not given to superstition. They'd driven Cutter's Pass dozens of times. There was nothing to fear except deer and the occasional pothole. At 10:37 p.m., Mia's mother called Josh's house. No answer. At 11:15 p.m., Evan's father drove to the dairy barn. The owner said they'd never showed up. By midnight, 4 sets of parents were in contact, their voices tight with a fear that hadn't yet crystallized into panic but was getting close. By 1 a.m., they'd called the sheriff. By sunrise, the entire town would be searching. 9 months and 400 miles south, The evening heat in Maple Hollow, Tennessee, pressed down like a wool blanket soaked in bath water. Cicadas screamed from the trees and waves, their song rising and falling in a rhythm that became almost hypnotic if you listened long enough. The air smelled of cut grass and honeysuckle, that sweet, cloying scent that defines southern summers. Emily Garrison was 10 years old, small for her age, with hair the color of wheat and a dusting of freckles across her nose. She was what her grandmother called mouse quiet, a child who observed more than she spoke, who preferred the company of books and her cat Whiskers to large groups. She was finishing 4th grade, and her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had written on her report card, "Emily has a beautiful, gentle spirit. She brings kindness to our classroom every day." That August evening, Emily had been working on a project at her kitchen table, a mason jar lantern decorated with tissue paper and glue, a craft she'd learned at the library's summer program. Her mother, Jean Garrison, was making dinner, occasionally glancing over at her daughter's careful, methodical work. Emily had chosen purple and yellow tissue paper, layering the colors until the jar glowed like a sunset when you held it up to the light. Around 6:30 p.m., Emily's best friend, Kayla, who lived 4 houses down on Sycamore Lane, called to ask if Emily could come over to see the new kittens Kayla's cat had just had. It was a short walk, less than a quarter mile, all within the same quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where children still played outside until the streetlights came on, where doors were left unlocked and keys were left in cars. Jean hesitated. It was a weeknight. Dinner was almost ready. But Emily's eyes had lit up at the mention of kittens. She loved animals with the intensity that was one of the few areas where her quiet nature gave way to pure joy. 20 minutes, Jean said, and stay on the sidewalk. Come straight back when Kayla's mom says it's time. Emily nodded, already pulling on her sneakers. She grabbed her small purple backpack. She took it everywhere, filled with whatever book she was currently reading, a sketch pad, and the gel pens she collected, and headed out the door. Jean watched from the porch as Emily walked down the sidewalk, her small figure growing smaller, until she turned the corner onto Maple Street. That was the last time Jean Garrison saw her daughter alive. By 7:15 p.m., when Emily hadn't returned, Jean called Kayla's house. Kayla's mother answered, confused. Emily had never arrived. Jean felt her stomach drop, that awful free-fall sensation that every parent knows and prays they'll never experience. She ran outside calling Emily's name, walking the route her daughter should have taken. Nothing. By 7:45 p.m. she'd called the police. By 8:30 p.m., patrol cars were circling the neighborhood, officers knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a small girl in a pink t-shirt and denim shorts. By 9 p.m., the volunteer fire department had been activated. By 10 p.m., more than 50 people had gathered at the Garrison home, organizing into search parties, dividing up streets and yards in the small wooded area behind the elementary school. Among those volunteers was Doug Rollins, a 34-year-old mechanic who lived 3 houses down from the Garrisons. He'd been working in his garage when he heard the sirens, had walked over to see what was happening. When he learned Emily was missing, he immediately volunteered to help search. He would search for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, helping organize grid patterns, walking side by side with Emily's mother through the woods behind the school, his voice hoarse from calling the little girl's name. What Jean Garrison didn't know, what no one knew, was that Emily was already dead, and Doug Rollins knew exactly where her body was because he had put it there. There's a particular kind of chaos that descends when a child goes missing, a organized frenzy that operates on pure adrenaline and hope and the desperate need to do something, anything, because standing still feels like giving up. The first 24 hours are crucial, everyone knows this, and so those first hours are consumed with motion searching, calling, organizing, distributing flyers, working the phones, checking and rechecking places already checked, because maybe somehow you missed something the first time. In Miller's Creek, the search for the 4 teenagers began at first light on Saturday morning, October 16, 1993. The sheriff's department established a command center in the high school parking lot, the same lot where the kids had been just 12 hours earlier, watching the football game, alive and laughing. The parents arrived in various states of shock. Mia's mother hadn't slept, her eyes red-rimmed and wild. Evan's father had spent the night driving every road within 20 miles, his truck's gas tank emptying twice, Josh's parents held hands so tightly their knuckles had gone white, as if letting go would somehow make everything more real. The sheriff, a methodical man named Tom Braddock who'd held the position for 15 years, laid out maps on the hood of his cruiser. "We start with a route," he said, his voice steady, trying to project calm he didn't feel. "Route 12 to Cutter's Pass. We work outward from there." The first teams headed out at 7 a.m., dozens of volunteers in orange vests spreading out along Cutter's Pass. The road itself was barely 2 lanes, hemmed in by dense forest oak and pine and poplar trees that created a canopy so thick that even in daylight, the road existed in a kind of perpetual dusk. The asphalt was cracked and buckled in places, and the shoulders dropped off steeply into ditches choked with kudzu and wild blackberry bushes. They searched the ditches first, volunteers walking in careful lines, pushing aside the vegetation with sticks, looking for any sign of piece of clothing. A disturbed patch of earth, skid marks on the road. The state police brought in a helicopter that afternoon, its rotors beating the air into submission, the sound echoing off the hills. From above, the pilot scanned the forest canopy, looking for any break in the green, any sign of the blue blazer that had to be out there somewhere. Dive teams were called in to search Harmon's Lake, a small, murky body of water about 6 miles from where the kids were last seen. There was no reason to think the car had ended up in the lake. No road led directly to it. But panic makes you thorough. The divers went down into the brown water again and again, their equipment stirring up clouds of sediment that reduced visibility to inches. They found nothing. By the third day, the search radius had expanded to 30 miles in every direction. Volunteers walked through fields of dry corn stalks that rattled like bones in the October wind. They searched abandoned barns and old mining caves, places where a car might have veered off the road in the dark. The Forest Ranger Service sent teams deep into the national forest, believing maybe the kids had taken a wrong turn, ended up lost on a logging road, their car stuck or broken down somewhere remote. Every lead was followed. A clerk at a gas station 30 miles north thought maybe she'd seen the blazer around 10 p.m. that Friday, but she couldn't be sure. A crushed soda can found near Cutter's Pass was analyzed. Had it been tossed from the car window? The brand was Pepsi. Josh drank Pepsi. But testing showed the can had been there for weeks. It meant nothing. The psychological toll was immediate and crushing. The high school held a prayer vigil on Sunday evening, 3 days after the disappearance. The gymnasium was packed. Students, teachers, people who'd graduated decades ago, entire families. They sang hymns and held candles and wept openly. 4 empty chairs sat in the front row, draped with the school's colors blue and gold. One person at that vigil was Gary Blake, Evan's uncle. He sat with his brother Evan's father and put his arm around him when the man began to cry during the singing of Amazing Grace. Gary had been involved in the search from the beginning, had taken time off from his construction job to drive the back roads, to help distribute flyers, to call distant relatives and friends of friends, spreading the word, asking if anyone had seen anything. He stood at copy machines for hours, printing flyer after flyer, 4 smiling faces above the word missing in bold red letters. What no one knew was that Gary Blake had killed those 4 kids himself, and their bodies, along with the blue blazer, were buried on his own property, less than 8 miles from the high school parking lot where everyone gathered to search. In Maple Hollow, the search for Emily Garrison was similarly all-consuming. The neighborhood where she lived was composed of modest houses on half-acre lots, most built in the 1960s, places where families stayed for generations. Everyone knew each other. Parents watched each other's kids. It was supposed to be safe. The police interviewed everyone on Sycamore Lane and Maple Street, the route Emily should have taken. Most people had been inside, eating dinner, watching television. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening. No one had noticed anything unusual. No one had seen Emily at all. Search parties formed organically, coordinated by the fire chief and the police department. They divided the neighborhood into sections, then expanded outward checking yards, storage sheds, the small drainage culverts that ran beneath the streets, the wooded area behind Wilson Elementary where kids sometimes played. On Wednesday morning, August 10, a volunteer searcher named Marcus Tate was checking the banks of Miller Creek, a shallow waterway that ran behind the elementary school and through several neighborhoods. The creek was barely 4 feet wide in most places, more of a drainage stream than a real creek, lined with algae-covered rocks and overgrown with willow trees and honeysuckle vines. At 9:47 a.m., Marcus saw something purple caught on a branch where the creek made a sharp bend. He waded into the water. It came up to his knees and retrieved it. It was a small purple backpack. Emily's backpack? The discovery was both a breakthrough and a nightmare. The backpack meant they were looking in the right area. But it also meant Emily had likely been in or near the creek, which raised terrifying questions. Had she fallen in? Been pushed? The creek wasn't deep enough to drown in, not for a 10-year-old unless she'd been hurt, unable to get up. The police took possession of the backpack immediately. It was opened carefully, its contents cataloged: one library book, Island of the Blue Dolphins, a sketch pad with drawings of cats, a plastic pencil case filled with gel pens, a half-eaten granola bar. The items were wet but intact. Most importantly, the backpack itself was described in the official report as surgically clean. No tears, no dirt ground into the fabric, no signs of being dragged through the woods. It had been placed there deliberately, not lost accidentally. The search intensified around the creek. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their handlers walking them up and down both banks. The dogs showed interest in several spots, but no body was found. Dive teams checked a few areas where the creek deepened into small pools. Nothing. The police also found something else near the backpack. A beer can, Budweiser, lying in the mud about 10 feet from where the backpack had been caught. It was collected as evidence, dusted for fingerprints. The prints were smudged, unusable. DNA testing in 1994 was still relatively primitive, expensive, and time-consuming. The can was logged into evidence and stored. For 3 days, Maple Hollow existed in a state of suspended horror. Search parties went out at dawn and came back after dark. The local churches provided food casseroles, sandwiches, coffee, and industrial-sized urns. News crews from Nashville set up on the street, their cameras documenting the grief and fear. Jean Garrison became a fixture at the Search Command Center, which had been set up in the elementary school cafeteria. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely speak. She held Emily's favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Mr. I, buttons, and waited for news that never came. Doug Rollins was there too, every day, every search party. He worked his regular shift at the garage, then came straight to the search. He was tireless, methodical, helpful. He walked the grid patterns assigned to him. He checked basements and crawl spaces. He called out Emily's name until his voice cracked. On Thursday morning, 2 days after Emily disappeared, Doug found himself walking next to Jean Garrison through the woods behind the school. It was a muggy, overcast day, the air thick and still. They moved slowly, pushing aside low branches, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. Jean was barely functioning. She stumbled over a fallen log, and Doug caught her arm, steadied her. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was destroyed from crying, from calling her daughter's name for 48 hours straight. "We're going to find her," Doug said, his voice gentle, reassuring. He met her eyes. "I promise we won't stop looking." Jean nodded, tears streaming down her face. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for being here," she said. "Thank you for helping." Doug would later confess to investigators, years later when the truth finally came out. "She thanked me for helping. That's when I knew I could never tell her." Because while they walked through those woods together, while Jean Garrison thanked a neighbor for his kindness, Emily's body lay buried less than 200 yards away, along the bank of Miller Creek, in a location Doug Rollins had chosen specifically because he knew the search parties would be focusing on other areas. He had killed her on Tuesday evening, within an hour of her leaving home. He had buried her before midnight, and then he had shown up Wednesday morning to help search, blending seamlessly into the crowd of concerned neighbors, offering comfort to a mother whose child he had murdered. Time moved differently after someone you love disappears. Days stretch and distort, measured not by clocks but by the phone calls that don't come, the leads that evaporate, the searches that yield nothing. Weeks become months, become years, and the acute panic of the early days hardens into something else, a permanent state of unfinished grief, of questions that can't be answered, of a loss that can't be properly mourned because there's no body, no closure, no absolute proof that hope is futile. The families of the missing live in purgatory. They exist between two impossible realities, the one where their loved one might still be alive somewhere, and the one where accepting death means giving up. So they stay suspended, waiting, unable to move forward or back. In the months and years following October 15, 1993, the disappearance of Evan Blake, Josh Carnes, Mia Dalton, and Claire Rivers became part of Millers Creek's collective identity. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. Private investigators were hired by the families, worked the case for months, then admitted they had found nothing new. Psychics called, offering visions and theories. A few were even taken seriously, escorted to locations they claimed held significance, where excavations turned up nothing but rocks and tree roots. The official investigation continued for years, but with diminishing intensity. The sheriff's department maintained an open file. Every few months, someone would call in a tip they'd seen a blue blazer in a barn in the next county, or they remembered seeing 4 teenagers at a rest stop that night, or they had a dream that felt significant. Every tip was investigated. All led nowhere. The most persistent theory involved a broken guardrail on a remote section of Cutter's Pass, about 12 miles from where the kids were last seen. The guardrail had been damaged, bent outward as if struck by a vehicle. Below it was a steep embankment that dropped 80 feet into a densely wooded ravine. The theory was that the blazer had gone off the road there, plunged into the ravine, and become hidden under years of fallen leaves and vegetation. The ravine was searched multiple times. Volunteers rappelled down the slope, combing through the undergrowth. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Ground-penetrating radar was used. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew over the area. Nothing was ever found. But the broken guardrail became a kind of shrine. People left flowers there, teddy bears, handwritten notes. Someone painted 4 small angels on a nearby tree trunk. The families aged under the weight of not knowing. Mia Dalton's mother developed severe depression and was hospitalized twice. Josh Carnes' younger sister, who was 13 when her brother disappeared, struggled with survivor's guilt and dropped out of school. Claire Rivers' father had a massive heart attack in 1997. During one of the winter searches he organized every year, where volunteers would comb the ridges when the trees were bare and visibility was best, he died before the ambulance arrived. Evan Blake's parents held out the longest. His mother maintained his bedroom exactly as he'd left it, his football trophies on the shelf, his senior year class schedule still tacked to the bulletin board. She set a place for him at the table on his birthday every year. His father spent every weekend from October through April, searching, driving, logging roads, hiking into remote areas, following up on tips that police had already dismissed. The physical toll was enormous. He developed heart problems. His doctor told him the stress was killing him. He kept searching anyway. In the community, the case evolved into something like folklore. The Millers Creek Four were mentioned in the same breath as other local mysteries unsolved, perhaps unsolvable. High school students who hadn't even been born in 1993 knew the story, would dare each other to drive Cutter's Pass at night, would tell embellished versions around campfires. The reality of 4 real people with families who grieved them got lost, sometimes in the mythology. And through all of it, Gary Blake lived his life. He attended the memorials. He comforted his brother when the man wept for his lost son. He went to work, paid his taxes, mowed his lawn. He built a workshop on his property in 1995, a large metal building where he stored construction equipment. The building was erected directly over the location where the blue blazer was buried, 15 feet underground. Its 4 young occupants still inside. For 13 years, Gary Blake kept his secret. And then, on a March morning in 2006, the earth gave it up. In Maple Hollow, the search for Emily Garrison followed a similar trajectory of desperate intensity followed by gradual, agonizing fade. The police investigation was extensive. Every registered sex offender within 50 miles was interviewed and alibied. Security footage from nearby gas stations and convenience stores was reviewed. Phone records were pulled. Hundreds of hours went into the case, but there were no witnesses, no physical evidence beyond the backpack and the beer can, no clear suspects. Emily had simply vanished in the space of 4 houses, in daylight, in a safe neighborhood. It seemed impossible, and yet it had happened. The case generated numerous theories and false leads. The most persistent involved a white pickup truck with a cracked side mirror. Multiple witnesses reported seeing such a truck in the neighborhood around the time Emily disappeared. The police spent months tracking down every white pickup in the county. None of the owners had any connection to Emily or any suspicious history. The cracked mirror turned out to be a detail that witnesses had collectively invented or misremembered, the psychological phenomenon of eyewitnesses influencing each other's memories, creating details that may never have existed. Another theory involved a drifter who had been seen panhandling near the elementary school the week before Emily disappeared. He was eventually located in Arkansas, where he'd been living rough under a bridge. He had an alibi for the day Emily vanished. He'd been in a hospital in Knoxville, being treated for pneumonia. His medical records confirmed it. There were darker undercurrents to the investigation as well, rumors that took years to fully surface. One involved a local deputy, Marcus Hensley, who had responded to the initial missing persons call. In 2002, 8 years after Emily disappeared, Deputy Hensley retired abruptly amid allegations of evidence tampering in an unrelated case. When his home was being cleared out after his death in 2018, family members found a locked metal box in his attic. Inside was a rusted metal hinge and a small notebook containing what appeared to be case notes that had never been entered into official reports. The significance of these items was never fully explained, but speculation ran rampant. Had Hensley been involved somehow? Had he covered something up? The investigation was long closed, and the answers died with him. For Jean Garrison, the years after Emily's disappearance were an exercise in sustained heartbreak. She left the porch light on every single night for 5 years, until the fixture finally burned out, and she couldn't bring herself to replace it. She kept Emily's room exactly as it was, the mason jar lantern still sitting on the kitchen table where Emily had left it, the purple and yellow tissue paper fading in the sunlight that came through the window each afternoon. She attended every support group meeting for families of missing children, drove hours to conferences, connected with other parents who understood the particular hell of not knowing. She never remarried, never moved from the house, couldn't bear the thought of not being there if Emily somehow found her way home. The community rallied around her initially, but as years passed, the intensity of support faded. People moved on with their lives. Emily's case was still mentioned occasionally on anniversaries of her disappearance. The local paper would run a story, but the daily active concern diminished. It's not that people stopped caring exactly. It's that the human mind can only sustain acute grief for so long before it has to turn to other things, to survival, to the demands of ongoing life. Doug Rollins attended Emily's memorial service on the first anniversary of her disappearance. He stood in the back of the church, listening to Jean Garrison speak about her daughter, her voice breaking as she read a poem Emily had written for Mother's Day the year before. When the service ended, Doug approached Jean, hugged her, told her he was so sorry, that he still hoped they'd find answers someday. Then he went home to the house he'd lived in for 10 years, 3 doors down from the Garrisons, and he went on with his life. He worked at the garage, fixed transmissions and brake lines, went to the bar on Friday nights, dated a woman from the next town over for a few years. The secret of what he'd done was a weight he carried, but he carried it. He adapted to it. He functioned. He had killed Emily Garrison on August 9, 1994, at approximately 6:45 p.m., less than 15 minutes after she'd left her house. He had buried her body along the bank of Miller Creek, in a location carefully chosen for its dense vegetation and relative isolation. He had cleaned up meticulously, burning his clothes in a barrel in his backyard, washing his truck bed with motor oil to mask any smell, disposing of the tools he'd used in a dumpster 20 miles away. And then he had waited for the investigation to pass over him, which it did. He'd been interviewed once, like every other resident of the neighborhood. He'd expressed appropriate shock and concern. The police had no reason to suspect him. He had no criminal record, no known connection to Emily beyond living on the same street. He passed. For 27 years he passed. And then, in 2021, technology caught up with him. There is an old saying that murder will out, that the truth will eventually surface no matter how deeply it's buried. But that's not quite accurate. The truth doesn't surface on its own. It requires a catalyst, a persistent investigator, a technological breakthrough, a twist of fate, and sometimes, after enough years have passed, the catalyst is simply the earth itself, refusing to keep the secret any longer. Howard Darnell had been farming his land in Miller's Creek for 38 years. He knew every acre, every fence line, every spot where the water pooled after heavy rains and made the ground soft. He'd inherited the property from his father, 150 acres of rolling hills used mostly for hay and cattle grazing. In March 2006, Howard was working on clearing a section of his back 40 that had been overgrown for years, preparing to plant a new hayfield. He was operating his tractor, a Case IH that he'd owned for a decade, pulling a bush hog to cut down the thick underbrush. The land back there was uneven, pocked with small depressions and rises old glacial topography that made farming difficult, which was why the section had been neglected for so long. At approximately 2:30 p.m., on March 14, Howard felt the tractor drop slightly on the right side, as if the ground beneath had suddenly given way about 6 inches. The sensation was subtle but wrong. He'd felt sinkholes before the region had limestone caves and occasional collapses, but this felt different, more solid somehow. He shut off the tractor and climbed down to investigate. Walking around to the right rear tire, he saw that it had sunk into a depression in the ground, but not a natural one. The shape was too regular, too defined. It was roughly rectangular, about the size of a car hood, and when he stomped on it, the ground made a hollow sound, like metal under soil. Howard had lived in Miller's Creek his entire life. He knew the story of the missing teenagers. Everyone did. And standing there in his back 40, looking at that depression in the ground, he felt his stomach go cold. He drove his truck back to the house and called the sheriff's department. By 4 p.m., police units were on the scene. By 5:02 p.m., an excavator had been dispatched. By nightfall, portable lights had been set up, casting harsh white illumination over what had become a crime scene. The excavation began that evening and continued through the night. What they found, 15 feet below the surface, was a blue Chevrolet Blazer, buried nose down at an angle, its roof partially crushed from the weight of earth and the passage of 13 years. The smell was the first thing that confirmed what everyone already knew: there were bodies inside. The smell of death, even after more than a decade, is unmistakable. It's sweet and acrid and wrong. A scent that triggers something primal in the human brain. A warning that says danger, sickness, death. The vehicle was extracted carefully over the course of 3 days. The process slowed by the need to preserve evidence, to document everything. When the Blazer finally emerged from the ground, covered in rust and packed earth, it was immediately transported to a forensic facility. Inside were the remains of 4 people. The autopsies and forensic analysis took weeks. But the findings were definitive. All 4 victims, Evan Blake, Josh Carnes, Mia Dalton, and Claire Rivers, had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck with a heavy object. The wound suggested they'd been attacked outside the vehicle, then placed inside it after death. But the most chilling details came from the car itself. The gear shift was in neutral. The headlights were still in the on position. The battery had long since died, but the switch showed they'd been left on, as if to create the appearance of an accident, and all 4 tires had been slashed with a blade, the cuts visible in the deteriorated rubber deliberate sabotage to prevent the vehicle from being driven away. The forensic team also found tool marks on the ground around where the Blazer had been, buried, impressions that matched a bucket of a mid-sized excavator. Someone with access to heavy equipment had buried the car and buried it deep, in a location remote enough that it might never have been found if not for Howard Darnell's expansion of his hayfields. The investigation reignited with intensity not seen since the first weeks after the disappearance. The property where the Blazer was found was examined in detail. It bordered several other parcels of land, including a wooded lot that had been owned since 1989 by Gary Blake, uncle of victim Evan Blake. Gary Blake had been a construction contractor. He owned excavation equipment. He had access to the land where the car was found. There was an old service road connecting the properties, barely visible but navigable by someone who knew it was there. Gary Blake was brought in for questioning on March 20, 2006. He was 49 years old, weathered from years of outdoor work, and he looked exhausted even before the interrogation began. He sat across from Detective Mark Sullivan, a state police investigator who'd been brought in to handle the case. The interrogation lasted 4 hours. Gary denied everything initially, claimed he had no idea how the car ended up buried on land adjacent to his property. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. Tool marks matched his excavator, soil samples from his property matched soil found in the Blazer, and crucially, a search of his workshop, the metal building erected in 1995, revealed something damning. Journal entries and receipts dating from late 1993, including a handwritten note that read, "Back 40 cleared. Project complete. RIP." Finally, around 7:30 p.m., Gary Blake broke. He put his head in his hands and confessed. The story he told was both mundane and horrifying. There had been a dispute over property lines, a long simmering argument with his brother Evan's father over where one property ended and another began. Gary had wanted to expand his business, felt his brother was being unreasonable. On the night of October 15, 1993, Gary had been drinking heavily. He'd been working late at a job site near Cutter's Pass when he saw his nephew's blue blazer come around the bend. In his intoxicated, angry state, he'd flagged him down. The kids had stopped, confused but not alarmed. It was Evan's uncle, someone they knew and trusted. Gary had started ranting about the property dispute, about being disrespected. When Evan tried to calm him down, tried to get his friends back in the car, Gary had snapped. He'd grabbed a tire iron from his truck and attacked. 4 young people, dead in minutes, because of a drunken rage and a property line. Gary had driven their car to his property using a back route he knew from his construction work. He'd used his excavator to dig a pit 15 feet deep, had rolled the blazer into it, and had covered it over. Working through the night, he'd slashed the tires first to make sure the car couldn't somehow be driven if the ground ever shifted. He'd positioned it to look like an accident, like maybe the car had plunged off a road and gotten buried in the landslide, if it was ever found at all. Then he'd gone to the search efforts. He'd helped his brother print flyers. He'd attended the vigils. He'd lived with what he'd done for 13 years. And according to his confession, he'd almost convinced himself it would stay buried forever. "I thought it was buried," he said to Detective Sullivan, his voice flat. That night wasn't supposed to go that way. Gary Blake was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was convicted in 2007 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died of a heart attack in 2019, 12 years into his sentence. For more than 2 decades, the evidence collected in Emily Garrison's case sat in a storage facility maintained by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The beer can found near Emily's backpack in Miller Creek had been tested in 1994 for fingerprints with no usable results. DNA testing had been attempted, but the technology in 1994 was primitive compared to what would come later. The sample taken from the can had been degraded, contaminated by mud and creek water. The results were inconclusive. But DNA technology advanced exponentially between 1994 and 2021. What was impossible to analyze in the early 1990s became routine procedure by the 2020s. More importantly, the development of familial DNA, searching the ability to compare crime scene DNA to genetic profiles in databases and identify not just exact matches but also close relatives, opened new possibilities for cold cases. In 2020, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation received a grant to re-examine cold cases using updated forensic techniques. Emily Garrison's case was selected for review. The beer can was retrieved from evidence storage and submitted for advanced DNA testing. This time, the results were clear. A viable DNA profile was extracted from saliva on the can's opening. The profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. There was no exact match. The person who'd handled that beer can had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA submission, but the familial search turned up something interesting. A partial match to a man named Leonard Rollins, who'd submitted his DNA to a commercial ancestry website in 2019. Leonard Rollins had a brother named Doug Rollins, who in 1994 had been living in Maple Hollow, Tennessee, 3 houses down from the Garrison family. Detectives from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation arrived at Doug Rollins' current residence. He'd moved to a small town in Kentucky in 2003 on September 8, 2021. He was now 61 years old, still working as a mechanic, living alone in a small house. He agreed to come in for questioning voluntarily. The interrogation was conducted by Detective Rachel Martinez, a specialist in cold cases. She'd reviewed every file, every witness statement, every piece of evidence. She knew this case as well as anyone could. She also knew something Doug Rollins didn't. They already had his DNA. A warrant had been obtained, and when Doug had touched the doorknob at the police station, that touch had provided a comparison sample. The results had come back before the interrogation even started. Doug Rollins' DNA was a match to the beer can found 10 feet from Emily Garrison's backpack in 1994. Detective Martinez didn't reveal that information immediately. She started with general questions, asked Doug if he remembered Emily Garrison, if he remembered the search. Doug said yes, of course he remembered. Terrible thing. He'd done everything he could to help. "You searched for 3 days straight," Martinez said. "Everyone did," Doug replied. "The whole neighborhood. You walked with Jean Garrison, Emily's mother." "Yeah, I did," That must have been hard, comforting, a mother looking for her dead daughter. Doug's expression changed slightly. We didn't know she was dead. We were still hoping. Martinez leaned forward. But you knew she was dead, didn't you, Doug? Because you killed her. Doug denied it, of course. Denied it forcefully, angrily. Demanded to know what she was talking about, why he was being accused. So Martinez showed him the DNA report. The look on Doug Rollins' face, according to Detective Martinez's later testimony, was one of genuine shock. He'd thought he'd gotten away with it. For 27 years, he thought he was safe. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Finally, around 11 p.m., Doug Rollins confessed. He'd been in his garage on the evening of August 9, 1994, working on his truck, drinking beer. He'd had 6 or 7 by that point, was well on his way to drunk. He saw Emily Garrison walking past his house, her purple backpack bouncing on her shoulders. He didn't know why he did what he did next. He couldn't explain it even years later, but he'd called out to her, said he had some kittens in his garage, asked if she wanted to see them. Emily had hesitated. Her mother had told her to go straight to Kayla's house. But she loved animals, and this was a neighbor, someone safe. She'd come into the garage. Doug Rollins killed her there. The method was brutal and quick. Then, in a panic, he'd wrapped her body in a tarp, put it in the back of his truck, and driven to Miller Creek. He'd buried her along the bank, in a spot where the vegetation was thick and the ground was soft. He'd taken her backpack and tossed it in the creek, thinking it would wash away or get buried in silt. He'd dropped his beer can without realizing it. Then he'd driven home, burned his clothes in a barrel, and washed his truck bed with motor oil, a mechanic's trick to eliminate any smell or residue. He'd hidden in plain sight by joining the search, by being helpful and concerned. No one had suspected him. He passed a polygraph test administered in 1995 as part of the investigation sweep of all neighborhood residents. Polygraphs aren't reliable, and his anxiety could easily be attributed to the stress everyone was feeling. But DNA doesn't lie. Detective Martinez asked him about walking with Jean Garrison, about comforting her while they searched for a girl he'd killed. Doug was quiet for a long time, then said quietly, "She thanked me for helping." That's when I knew I could never tell her. Doug Rollins was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. He pled guilty in exchange for a sentence of life without parole, avoiding the death penalty. He is currently incarcerated at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. As part of his plea agreement, he led investigators to the exact location where he buried Emily. Recovery efforts began in October 2021, 27 years after her death. Emily Garrison's remains were found in a shallow grave along the bank of Miller Creek, less than 200 yards from where the search parties had walked in August 1994. Doug Rollins had been right there helping search, while standing almost on top of her grave. The arrest and conviction of a suspect, particularly in a cold case decades old, should bring closure. That's what we tell ourselves, what we see in movies and television shows. The handcuffs click shut, the family members embrace, justice is served, and everyone can finally move forward. But real closure, for families who've waited years or decades for answers, is far more complicated. Because learning the truth often means learning that the person who helped search, who comforted you, who sat at your table and cried with you, was the very person who caused all that pain. And that knowledge doesn't heal. It scars in new ways. When Gary Blake confessed to killing his nephew and 3 other teenagers, the reaction in Miller's Creek wasn't relief. It was a kind of collective trauma, a shattering of what little faith remained. The fact that Gary had been involved in the search from the beginning, that he'd stood next to his brother at vigils, that he'd helped design the missing person flyers, that he'd organized volunteer search parties made the betrayal almost incomprehensible. People who'd known Gary for decades struggled to reconcile the helpful neighbor with the man who'd committed quadruple murder over a property dispute. In his confession, Gary described the night of October 15, 1993, in clinical detail. He'd been working late at a construction site, drinking bourbon from a flask, becoming increasingly angry about the ongoing argument with his brother. When he saw the blue blazer coming around the bend on Cutter's Pass, something in him snapped. He'd flagged them down. Evan had recognized his uncle's truck, had pulled over thinking maybe the truck had broken down. Gary had approached the driver's side window, had started ranting. The kids were confused, frightened by his incoherent anger. When Evan got out of the car to try to calm him down, Gary had grabbed a tire iron from his truck bed and swung it. The violence was sudden and overwhelming. Evan fell. The others tried to run. Gary chased them down on that dark rural road and killed each of them. The entire incident, from the moment he flagged them down to the moment he stood over 4 bodies, took less than 10 minutes. Then came the calculation. He couldn't call the police. He couldn't explain this, so he decided to make them disappear. He used his cell phone, a rarity in 1993, but he had one for work to call a friend who owed him a favor. Got the friend to help him load the bodies back into the Blazer. He drove the car to his property using old bogging roads, his friend following in Gary's truck. They worked through the night using Gary's excavator to dig a pit 15 feet deep. Gary slashed the tires, positioned the car as if it had crashed, and buried it. His friend, according to Gary's confession, was terrified, wanted no part of it. Gary paid him $5,000 cash and told him if he ever said anything, Gary would claim the friend had done it. The friend moved to Florida 6 months later and died in a car accident in 1998. Whatever he knew, he took to his grave. Gary went home at dawn, showered, and started receiving phone calls from his brother. Evan hadn't come home. Gary expressed shock and concern, promised to help search. And he did. For 13 years, he maintained the lie. In a jailhouse interview conducted in 2008, a year after his conviction, Gary Blake was asked if he felt remorse. His answer was chilling in its banality. "I think about it every day. That night wasn't supposed to go that way. I was drunk and angry, and I made a mistake. But after it was done, what was I supposed to do? Turn myself in? Destroy my brother's life even more? So I just kept going." When pressed about attending the vigils, about comforting the families, Gary became defensive. What was I supposed to do? Not show up? That would have been suspicious. I had to act normal. The psychological compartmentalization required to attend your nephew's memorial service, to hug your brother while he wept for his missing son, to organize search parties for victims you yourself killed. It's almost impossible to fathom, but Gary Blake did it, apparently with relative ease, for over a decade. The families of the victims struggled with this knowledge. Evan Blake's mother, in particular, was destroyed by the revelation, and a victim impact statement read at Gary's sentencing. She wrote, "You weren't just the person who killed my son. You were the person I leaned on when I needed strength. You held me when I cried. You told me we'd find him. And the whole time you knew exactly where he was, because you put him there. That betrayal is worse than the murder itself." Mia Dalton's father put it even more starkly. "You took our children. Then you took 13 years of our lives searching for them. Then you took our ability to trust anyone ever again." The revelation that Doug Rollins had killed Emily Garrison was, if possible, even more psychologically disturbing than the Blake case, because Doug didn't just participate in the search. He walked the very ground where Emily was buried, potentially walking directly over her grave while calling out her name. In his confession, Doug described killing Emily in his garage, then panicking. He'd never committed a violent act before, had no criminal history, no history of violence. He was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary man. But in that garage on August 9th, 1994, fueled by alcohol and something he could never adequately explain, he committed an atrocity. The burial location was chosen carefully. He knew Miller Creek well. He'd lived in the neighborhood for years. He knew there was a section of the creek bank behind the elementary school where the vegetation was particularly dense. Willow trees hung low over the water. Honeysuckle vines created thick tangles, and the ground was soft enough to dig without heavy equipment. He'd buried Emily in the dark, using a shovel, working quickly. The grave was shallow, maybe 3 feet deep, but the location was well hidden. He'd scattered leaves and branches over the disturbed earth, had piled fallen logs on top. Then he tossed Emily's backpack into the creek, thinking the current would carry it downstream, away from the burial site. He didn't realize it would catch on a branch just a few hundred feet away. The next morning when the search began, Doug had joined immediately. In his confession, he claimed it was because not joining would have looked suspicious. Everyone else in the neighborhood was helping, and his absence would have been noted. But there was more to it than that. Detective Martinez, in her report, noted that Doug seemed to have a compulsion to be close to the investigation, to know what was being found, what the police knew. He'd walked through those woods dozens of times over the 3-day intensive search. He'd stood near Emily's grave multiple times, had probably walked directly over it, and he'd done so while standing next to Emily's mother, while comforting her, while promising they'd find her daughter. The psychological dynamics of this behavior are what criminologists call injecting himself into the investigation. It's not uncommon for killers, particularly those who commit crimes in their own communities, to participate in searches or investigations. There are multiple motivations: monitoring what police know, appearing normal and helpful to avoid suspicion, and in some cases, deriving a sense of control or even satisfaction from the deception. In Doug Rollins' case, it appears to have been primarily about avoiding suspicion, but the psychological toll of maintaining that deception was evident in his confession. He described feelings of extreme anxiety during the searches, particularly when walking with Jean Garrison. He said he felt like he was going to vomit, that his heart was racing, that he was certain someone would see through him, but no one did. He described the moment when Jean thanked him for helping as a turning point. "She thanked me for helping. That's when I knew I could never tell her." The guilt of accepting gratitude from a woman whose child he'd murdered created a psychological lock he couldn't confess, because doing so would mean revealing the full extent of his betrayal. So he buried it, compartmentalized it, and moved on with his life. There were other disturbing details that emerged from the investigation following Doug's arrest. Investigators discovered that, in the weeks after Emily's death, Doug had burned his clothes in a barrel in his backyard. Neighbors remembered seeing the fire, but thought nothing of it at the time. He'd also washed his truck bed with motor oil, an unusual choice unless you're trying to mask the smell of decomposition. And crucially, he'd called in sick to work on August 10, 1994, the day after Emily disappeared, claiming he had the flu. Co-workers remembered this as unusual. Doug rarely took sick days. All of these actions indicated premeditation in the cover-up, a calculated effort to destroy evidence and create an alibi. And it had worked. For 27 years, it had worked. The aspect of the case that haunted investigators the most was how close they'd come to discovering the truth in 1994. The beer can had been found. It had been tested, but the technology wasn't sophisticated enough at the time to extract usable DNA from the degraded sample. If the same testing available in 2021 had existed in 1994, Doug Rollins would have been arrested within weeks. Emily's body would have been recovered. Her family would have had closure nearly 3 decades earlier. The families of the Millers Creek Four and of Emily Garrison had been living in a kind of suspended grief for decades, the agony of not knowing, of questions that couldn't be answered. The arrest and confessions of Gary Blake and Doug Rollins were supposed to provide closure, to finally allow the families to grieve properly and move forward. But for many, the truth was almost harder to bear than the uncertainty, because now they had to grapple with not just the loss of their loved ones, but with the knowledge of who had taken them and how those killers had deceived them for so long. Jean Garrison, in interviews following Doug Rollins' conviction, described the feeling as being victimized twice. "First, he took my daughter. Then he took my grief and contaminated it. Every memory I have of those searches, of people being kind and helpful, is now tainted. I can't look back on that time without seeing his face, without remembering that he was there, lying to me, while my baby was in the ground. He didn't just kill Emily. He killed my ability to trust, to believe in the goodness of people." She also spoke about the specific memory of walking through the woods with Doug, of thanking him for helping. When she learned that Emily's grave had been less than 200 yards away at that moment, she became physically ill. The thought that she'd been so close to her daughter, that Doug had known it, that he'd stood there accepting her gratitude while standing almost on top of Emily's body, it was a violation beyond comprehension. In her final victim impact statement delivered at Doug Rollins' sentencing, Jean Garrison said, "Quiet is what you took from us. My house used to be full of sound. Emily singing off-key in the shower, her footsteps on the stairs, her voice calling for me. Now it's silent. And that silence is your legacy. Not just the silence of death, but the silence of trust broken, of innocence destroyed, of a community that will never feel safe again." The families of the Millers Creek Four expressed similar sentiments. The knowledge that Gary Blake, a family member, had not only killed Evan, but had participated in the search, had hugged his brother at vigils, had passed out flyers with Evan's face on them. It was a betrayal that transcended the murder itself. Evan's surviving family members largely retreated from public life after Gary's conviction. His mother refused all interview requests. His father, in one of the few statements he made, said simply, "I don't have a brother anymore. I never did. The person I thought was my brother died a long time ago, or maybe never existed at all." In Maple Hollow, Tennessee, there is a bench in the small park near Miller Creek. It was installed in 2022, funded by community donations, and bears a small plaque that reads, "Emily Garrison, 1984 to 1994. She walked home alone, but she is never alone again." The bench sits under a willow tree, facing the creek. On any given day, you might find flowers left there, or small toys, or handwritten notes from people who never knew Emily, but who cannot forget her. The bench is close to, though not marking the location where Emily's body was recovered. It has become a place of pilgrimage for those touched by her story, a physical location to process grief and rage and the incomprehensibility of what happened. Jean Garrison visits the bench every Sunday. She brings fresh flowers and sits for an hour, sometimes talking quietly, sometimes just sitting in silence. She is 63 now, her hair gray, her face worn by years of grief. She never remarried, never moved from the house on Sycamore Lane. She says she stays because it's where Emily knew to find her, if she ever came home. The fact that Emily will never come home doesn't change the instinct. In Millers Creek, Kentucky, there is no single monument. Instead, there are four. 4 scholarships were established in 2007, one for each of the victims: Evan Blake, Josh Carnes, Mia Dalton, and Claire Rivers. Each year, 4 graduating seniors from Millers Creek High School receive full scholarships to state universities, awarded to students who embody the qualities the 4 teens represented: kindness, creativity, academic excellence, and leadership. The field where the Blue Blazer was buried is now owned by a land conservancy. It will never be developed. It exists as open space, surrounded by trees, silent except for birdsong and the wind through the grass. There's a small marker at the edge of the property, visible from the road, in memory of the Millers Creek 4, gone but never forgotten. The families have aged, as all families do. Some have found ways to channel their grief into advocacy, working with cold case organizations, supporting DNA testing initiatives, lobbying for better resources for families of missing persons. Others have retreated into privacy, unable or unwilling to make their pain public. The communities of Millers Creek and Maple Hollow have changed in subtle ways. There is a wariness now, a knowledge that safety is an illusion, that the person standing next to you could be hiding anything. Parents hold their children's hands a little tighter. Neighbors are friendly but distant. Trust, once broken so profoundly, is difficult to restore. What makes the cases of Gary Blake and Doug Rollins particularly haunting is not just the murders themselves, but the sustained deception that followed. These were not strangers who abducted victims and disappeared into the night. These were members of the community, a family member, a neighbor who killed people they knew, and then participated in the search for them. This behavior forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil. We want to believe that evil announces itself, that we would recognize it if we encountered it. We want to believe that someone capable of murdering a child or a group of teenagers would somehow betray themselves, would be unable to maintain a facade of normalcy. But Gary Blake and Doug Rollins prove otherwise. They lived ordinary lives. They had jobs and friends and routines. They helped their neighbors. They showed up to community events. They were, by all outward appearances, normal. The psychological term for this is compartmentalization, the ability to separate conflicting thoughts, emotions, or behaviors into distinct mental categories that don't interact. Gary Blake could murder 4 teenagers and then attend their memorial service because he constructed separate mental spaces for the thing that happened that night and my role as uncle and community member. Doug Rollins could bury a child and then help search for her because he'd separated what I did from who I am in public. This compartmentalization is more common than we'd like to admit. It's how people commit atrocities and then go home and play with their own children. It's how individuals can hold contradictory beliefs or engage in behaviors that directly conflict with their stated values. The human mind is capable of astonishing feats of self-deception and rationalization. For the families of victims, this is perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. It means that the person comforting them, helping them, standing beside them was fully capable of maintaining that deception. There was no moment of weakness, no crack in the facade. The comfort offered was hollow, the help a performance, and realizing that the support they leaned on during their darkest hours was a lie creates a secondary trauma that can be as damaging as the original loss. Jean Garrison's words at Doug Rawlinson's resonate beyond her specific case. Quiet is what you took from us. It's a profound observation about the nature of these crimes. The obvious theft is the life taken Emily Garrison, Evan Blake, Josh Carnes, Mia Dalton, Claire Rivers, young people with futures stretching out before them, with dreams and plans and people who loved them, all snuffed out in moments of violence. But the less obvious theft is the quiet that follows, not the peace of closure, but the oppressive silence of unanswered questions, of trust destroyed, of a community's innocence lost. The quiet of houses that should be filled with sound but aren't. The quiet of vigils and memorials and anniversaries where people gather but struggle to find words. The quiet of families who've learned that the world is not safe, that monsters don't always look like monsters, that sometimes evil holds your hand and helps you search. This is the legacy of cases like these, not just the individual tragedies, but the collective understanding that we are more vulnerable than we believed, that our trust can be weaponized against us, that the person standing next to you in the search line might be the very person you're searching for. Gary Blake died in prison in 2019, taking whatever final thoughts or remorse he may have felt with him. Doug Rawlins remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Neither will ever be free, but their victims remain frozen in time 17, 17, 17, 17, and 10 years old. They never got to grow up, never got to become who they might have been. And the families, the parents and siblings and friends, they remain caught between memory and loss, between the people they loved and the knowledge of how those people were taken from them. They carry on because there's no other choice, but they carry the weight of betrayal alongside the weight of grief. The search never really ends for families of the murdered. They search for meaning, for justice, for some way to make sense of the senseless, and in cases like Miller's Creek and Maple Hollow, they search for a way to reconcile the help they received with the horror of who was helping them. In the end, there is no reconciliation. There is only the truth finally revealed, and the long, difficult work of learning to live with it. The monuments and scholarships and memorial benches are attempts to reclaim something from the loss, to say that these lives mattered, that they will not be forgotten. But on quiet days, in quiet moments, the families of the Miller's Creek Four and of Emily Garrison still hear the silence of voices that should be there but aren't, of futures that should have unfolded but didn't, of trust that should have been honored but was violated in the worst possible way. Quiet is what was taken, and quiet is what remains.